Hello and welcome to the presentation by Reese Pugachev, myself, for SOCI 363. This is topic assignment 4, parts A and B. All right, so I have titled this The Weight of Emotional Labor, and I decided because this is such a depressing topic, I decided to go with a lighter color scheme. And this adorable sea turtle with succulents is going to take us through our journey. All right, part A. So, in this presentation, we'll be going over the uh, flawed solutions to the work life balance, and then we'll move on to the health and safety issues in social work. And then we're going to move on to a strategy for those health and safety issues and whether or not they are effective. And then we're going to move on to media depictions of emotional labor, first defining what it is in reality, and then deciding whether or not that media depiction is accurate or not. And then we're going to go into whether or not emotional labor is a thing for social workers. It definitely is. So we're going to go with the definition first, and then whether or not that emotional labor makes social workers feel alienated or are they in control in any way. All right, so first up is the flawed solutions to the work-life balance and why. So the two solutions are self-employment and part-time work. Um, First of all, self-employment is difficult, and I have personal experience with both of these. So I know that income support is extremely difficult to get. And that's because it depends what kind of self-employment you're doing. So, for example, if you're a freelancer who's writing for various companies based on contract work, you don't get income support for that because it's literally written in your contract because you don't own any part of the company. So therefore, and because you basically sign a contract with that company, signing away your employee rights altogether. So, and in addition, the bigger part is also because as a freelance worker, you're not paying taxes. So, like nothing comes out of your wages. You're not paying taxes. You're not paying your RSVP. Is that the right word? I don't think that's the right abbreviation. The retirement pension thing. Um, and you're not paying the percentage towards EI. None of that. That's all going towards you because it's not technically tax deductible because the company is putting it on their taxes, but for you, it's just like, I guess it's the equivalent of somebody gifting you money. So, like, sure, it goes on your taxes, but it's not technically income, technically. So, anyway, that all matters when you're applying to income support, and it's a headache and it sucks. Um, so, say you knew this was going to happen, so you came with, a bucket of or a suitcase full of money. um, Self-employment usually means you're starting your own business, be that whatever form that might be, nonprofit or for-profit. There are going to be a lot of out-of-pocket costs, and they're all going to come from you. There's very little in the way of grants. And loans depend entirely on your personal credit. So if you have a very low credit, for example, you're unable to apply for loans because, again, it's you personally doing it. Um, it depending again on what type of self-employment you're doing, it's can be very difficult to get that loan and, in addition, pay it back. Especially in times like right now with COVID, because a lot of businesses, especially small businesses, require in person contact. So that can be really difficult. Um, and if you're starting your own business or you're part of a startup in some way, that probably means you're going to be working at home. And that means a lot of unpaid hours. Um, Even if write that, claim it on your taxes and stuff, it's not much. And of course, taxes only come around once a year. um, so like that's not a reliable income. And again, you have no way of predicting um, when the government is going to decide to pay you unless they tell you, and so forth. Um, so again, that's dependent on, again, whether or not you can get income support, and if you can log those hours at all, um, and be paid for them in any way. And working at home, as I'm sure many of us have realized, results in a lot of overtime. We have realized that not only can we take work home and do it from home, we also have the ability to be in constant contact with our employers and whatever work we're doing. So that can lead to a lot of stress and burnout. Um, and then let's move on to part time work. So this is flawed because a lot of part time work is underpaid or it doesn't pay very well. And it will not, it will likely not cover your cost of living. So, what kind of free time do you have if you're spending most of that time worrying about whether or not you can pay your phone bill or uh, if you have a car, your insurance, your car loan? If you don't have a car, maybe that, what is it these days, like 160 something for a monthly transit pass. In Calgary, at least. In Red Deer, it's a lot cheaper, which is nice. Um, or a million things. It could depend. And a lot of those things cost a lot of money, and part-time work doesn't necessarily cover it all. And that can be really tough. And again, what, you know, balance is that really when most of the time you're worrying about whether or not you can pay something because you're not working enough and your work doesn't pay you enough in order to do, the rest of your, in order to remove that money stress. So again, these solutions are extremely flawed, and personal experience, I can tell you that it's not fun. And one of the main solutions, as I'm sure you know, is going back to school, which unfortunately is something I have done, but I swear I'm happy with my decision. But it's something a lot of people have been forced to do. So essentially, they're living off of student loans and then hoping to get a job out of that education, as are we all, honestly. All right, so some health and safety issues in social work. So I chose mental health and physical safety because I think those are two extremely prevalent um, health and safety issues for social workers across the board. whether you can call yourself a social worker or you're just working in the field of social work in any way, um, it can certainly take its toll on you. And these two things are one of those, are the main parts. And they're not always rectified, they're not always dealt with by the employer in a way that's helpful to the employee. And of course, it depends, and the job itself is stressful, which we'll discuss. So, what kind of like mental health issues do social workers face? So, this is from an article by uh, Rith and a few other authors titled Working Conditions, Mental Health, and Coping of Staff in Social Work with Refugees and Homeless Individuals, from the British Journal of Social Work. These all have amazing long titles. And when we get there, yes, his name really is Guest. It's Aaron Guest. I know. I thought it was a guest writer first, but it's not. It's his real name. um, so, mental health in social work can look like, or rather, according to this study, that staff in social work that work with refugees and homeless individuals report that they have problems in mentally switching off after work and that they took their clients' issues home with them. Um, it was further described by these social workers that they had feelings of frustration and demoralization, stress, and sadness as a consequence. And needless to say, that really sucks. And is also completely understandable. When you're watching tragedy unfold and you're often helpless to help these people in effective ways, or you're just doing your best, or sometimes the process takes a bit long, or such and such, etc., etc. It takes a toll. You're only human. You're gonna take that home with you because unless you're a psychopath, you're gonna feel empathetic. You're gonna understand, and there's a reason a lot of these people go into social work, and a lot of that reason is to try and help people. So, yeah, empathy is a huge part of that job. And again, obviously, they take that home. And I absolutely understand the inability to switch off, and be able to relax once you're home and just get away from work entirely because, you're probably thinking and thinking on these complex issues that are basically out of your hands, and a lot of them are results of, society. So that's a whole thing. um, and in addition to all of that mental weight, we have physical safety. So, according to the study by Guest, Aaron Guest, titled Social Worker Safety, an Area Worthy of Continued Professional Concern and Attention, in the Professional Safety Journal. Um, so he says that on average, 44.4% said that social workers participated in some form of unsafe work behavior. For example, working in a setting alone, working without other individuals knowing where you are, 0 to 5 times a month, while 25.9% reported that they engaged in some unsafe work behavior 16 or more times a month, which is almost every day. um, and I want to read some more statistics from this study too, because I find them quite shocking. Well, maybe not shocking, but impressive. I don't know. um, he also says that 32.8 stated that percent stated that they had been victims of verbal assaults or threats, and that another portion were victims of physical assaults from adults and adolescents. Um, and what Guest points out too is though training and education does occur, almost 70% state that they have and that they've received this, training to recognize and handle this assault behavior, but only 8% of that reported that they were prepared to handle workplace violence. So I think that's huge. And I think that that's very sad, that social workers feel so unsafe and are so prone to working in unsafe environments, and how easy it is for them to admit this. Like, that's crazy. So, what kind of strategies are there in place, hopefully, to encourage, this kind of training and education for at least for more than 8% to feel, prepared. Um, so, what I found were the National Association of Social Workers guidelines. And as far as I can tell, the association does not, uh, they're not personally implementing these guidelines. These are, guides. Um, and as such, they these are just like a rubric for employers to look after, or the government to look at and be like, oh, this is what I should be doing. Um, so unfortunately, even with these, even with these guidelines, a lot of employers probably aren't taking heed or necessarily implementing all of it, or maybe it is written down somewhere, but they're not implementing it, etc. But what are these guidelines? Let's start with that first. So, these guidelines include office safety, use of safety technology, use of mobile phones, assessment for field visits, transporting clients, comprehensive reporting practices, post incident reporting and response, safety training, and student safety. So that's a lot, but I am just going to go with um, office safety and kind of elaborate on the kinds of protocols that the association um, wishes for, essentially, that they think are ideal. So office safety should mean working in spaces that allow for social workers to exit easily in potentially violent situations, access to alarm systems that can alert others to safety, risk, or breach, access to visually open meeting spaces, or presence of another staff team member when meeting with a client, um, restricted access to objects that may be used as weapons, um, which the examples they put can be quite innocuous. Stapler, paperweights, scissors, um, molded plastic chairs, or office decor that can be picked up and thrown, and so forth. Secure entry and access, and well lit hallways that lead to employees' workspaces, and secure entrances to employees' workspaces that are separate from public spaces. Um, and this is from pages 12 to 13. Um, so a lot of that is, again, well and good and definitely would be pretty effective, especially when they mention something like bulletproof glass, but that sounds really scary. I mean, because it implies the possibility of a bullet, right? Um, so, as much as I understand that these um, guidelines and would be ideal policies, they might not always be, like I said before, properly implemented, or perhaps, the funds simply aren't there. Because a lot of these uh, social worker uh, companies or businesses or what have you are nonprofit or government run, and there's very limited grant money and so forth involved, and that can limit safety, and that sucks. And sometimes there's just not a whole lot you can do. All right, part B. So, media depictions of emotional labor, and I chose Criminal Minds because, of course. Um, so, obviously, first and foremost, I have never worked in the criminology field, and um, my notion of what an accurate depiction of emotional labor in law enforcement looks like is entirely based on conjecture. So, I searched for a definition and what that reality looks like, and I found a study by Masteracci, definitely Italian, and Adams, uh, titled "It's Not Depersonalization, It's Emotional Labor: Examining Surface Acting and Use of Force with Evidence from the U.S." From the International Journal of Law, Crime and Justice. I told you they were long titles. um, so he says that he in between defining emotional labor and such. He says that the use of force is one option a police officer can use to achieve compliance from a suspect. And emotional labor is a fundamental aspect of policing. Officers must consistently work in situations where they must monitor and regulate their own and others' emotion. And to further elaborate on that, because I think it's quite important to say that this emotional labor goes quite deep for law enforcement. Um, and the range of emotional displays required of police officers only increases the need to pretend expression or to take the time and energy to convince themselves of the appropriateness of the emotional display. If authentic feelings are already in line with occupational display rules, then little emotional labor is required, just as when an officer's identity is in line with their values. However, requirements to use coercion can result in cognitive dissonance, and that results in greater depersonalization in officers. Um, that is absolutely depicted in Criminal Minds. So I divided that into surface acting and eliciting a specific behavior in someone else, specifically a suspect, in this particular case, because they were talking about law enforcement. Um, Surface acting is happens quite a lot, but particularly it will happen when a character in Criminal Minds, usually one of the main characters, is personally involved in a case that they're working in that particular episode. And I chose an example that occurs in season 5, episode 13, titled Risky Business. This is where a character named JJ, she is forced to push aside her emotions regarding a case because her personal connection with it is that the case is extremely similar to, and is also occurred in the same place as where her sister died. And eventually, throughout the episode, we find out that the murderer was also the same. Sorry for the spoiler if you haven't watched it yet. um, so Though I agree that this kind of surface acting that JJ is forced to do in order to do her job, um, and still participate in the case, because being personally involved means you definitely want to see where it goes and you want to know who did it, right? And you want a sense of justice or revenge, right? Though luckily revenge isn't quite the case. um, but still surface acting and that kind of cognitive dissonance that Master Archie and Adams talked about definitely comes to light in that episode a lot with JJ. Um, and of course her friends as well, because her coworkers are her friends and they are all working the same case, and that can get tricky too. Um, and again, though this depiction is probably accurate, based on what Master Archie says, um, the aftermath is not there. um, there is no depiction or showing at all of JJ's mental health afterwards, after the case is resolved. Never mind that there's a whole court process that happens afterwards once a case is solved, and witnesses and so forth, which she would definitely be a part of. But the show never shows any of that. And they never show her, taking a day off. In fact, this particular character is shown to have be quite a workaholic and not take any days off. And the show never sees JJ speaking to a therapist about what happened, what happened to her sister and that experience, or the case and her reaction to it. It never talks about that at all, which again is something that I think is quite inaccurate, because I think there is certain requirements for um, law enforcement officers and employees to be able to take those days off, like mental health days essentially, in order to be able to go back to their job and be able to do it effectively without having their mind be completely something else, or mourning, or what have you, whatever the case might be. Um, and then eliciting specific behaviors in others. In my opinion, this happens in every episode of Criminal Minds, because it's essentially a requirement during interrogations in order to get a specific response from the suspect, regardless of how guilty the um, officers may or may not think that that person is. There's just a certain behavior that is required to elicit, I won't say honesty, but like information, pulling specific types of information, and um, because as we're all human, we kind of require that personal connection with someone before we reveal personal details, and sometimes those personal details can be key to a case. So, yeah, you know, law enforcement officers are probably going to coerce and behave in a specific way. Like we've all heard of the good cop, bad cop trope. That's absolutely an example of emotional labor and having to behave a certain way in order to get what you want, in order to get the suspect or whomever to give you what you're looking for, to again behave in a certain way that gets you what you want. And um, again, even more cognitive dissonance because you're putting on an act, you're not acting like yourself. Um, Again, surface acting. And if you act like someone else often enough, that has a toll on your mental health, needless to say. um, all right, so emotional labor in the context of social workers. So this definition I pulled from uh, Winter, Morrison, Cree, Roosh, Hadfield, and Hallett's emotional labor in social workers' encounters with children and their families, from the British Journal of Social Work. I feel like I may have misnamed something. I think so. When I was talking about Rith, maybe? I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I did. um, anyway, so what does emotional labor look like for social workers? So essentially, what Winter et al. Gets to in their study is that social workers, because of their work, they have to focus on their relationships with children and families, and um, in strengthening those relationships and improving the quality of those relationships means putting emotional dimensions center stage, and it's completely unavoidable. As Winter says so eloquently, there is no way to. Sorry, I just lost it. There's no way to avoid it uh, or sanitize it. Emotions and feelings are an integral part of who we are, what we do, and how we engage, basically, as humans. It also means paying attention to factors that shape and influence emotions, and that can include gender, age, status, and organizational context. Um, so I think Winter et al. Put that really well, is that in order to uh, do the work of a social worker, you need to form relationships with people, and those people often are the underdogs of society. They're not at their best, um, and sometimes they're most definitely at their worst. And there's no way around it. Social workers have to form relationships with these people. Otherwise, there's no helping them, or you're disassociating, or there's that cognitive dissonance that McGarty talked about. Um, a whole slew of problems all on its own if you try to avoid that. And because it's based on emotions and emotional labor, that is, again, something that you take home, like we talked about with mental health, in health and safety issues. It is absolutely a factor. So, is emotional labor for social workers alienating, or do they feel in control? And I do believe that social workers might have that measure of control. Like what I talked about before, like if you just turn off essentially. But again, that's not healthy. And that is, as emotional labor theorists say, is that that's all surface acting. It's all cognitive dissonance. It's all disassociating and depersonalizing and dehumanizing and all of the above. So it, there's control, I guess, but I don't know if that would be really healthy control or if you would even call it control. Um, so alienation certainly does happen. Um, and again, emotional labor is necessary to do social work. You don't have a choice. um, so as I said before, they have to form relationships with extremely vulnerable people and then decide those people's fates, essentially, like whether or not they can go into a program or not, whether they are eligible for this program or that program, or if they're eligible for this benefit, or if they're not, if what direction they can go, whether or not they'll have a house in the next month, a home of any kind, a bed to sleep on. And as I say, no regular human can walk away from a job like that and not feel alienated. Because again, there's again that emotional labor is impossible to avoid. And again, sometimes control can come in the form of dissociation, surface acting, and sometimes that means breaking rules and policies to uh, in order to ensure the safety of either the clients, those vulnerable people, or themselves. Again, speaking of those health and safety issues, what about their physical safety? What about their mental health? Sometimes you have to protect yourself from situations where you might, where that might cause even more damage to your psyche. And that sucks. So, as this entire presentation has stated, the weight of emotional labor is huge and heavy as hell. And it definitely comes in all forms, not just law enforcement and social work, or retail, as the textbook, or call centers, as the textbook so lovingly talks about so often. I really wish there were more studies um, in other fields. Um, but yeah, so it has a huge weight, it's heavy, and it's difficult to combat. Sometimes technology can help, sometimes it can hinder, sometimes proper guideline or proper policies that are actually enforced can help. But or unions are a good example. More workers' rights, more reasonable hours, mental health supports, health insurance, and the like. That can all help, but in the end, it's all a huge systemic problem, and that can really suck. And that makes it a complex problem even more complicated. But anyway, here are my references, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation, and I'll see you in the next one.